Get your hands off me! The scream echoed through the jetway. Metal walls amplifying the terror in Victoria Chen's voice as she felt herself falling backward, the cold aluminum ramp stealing her balance in one violent instant. But that moment was still 3 hours away. Victoria Chen stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of her Seattle penthouse, watching the city wake up beneath a blanket of gray morning clouds that seemed to mirror her own restless energy. At 28, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from being raised by Jonathan Chen, a man who had built Chen Technologies from a cramped garage in Bellevue into a $3 billion infrastructure empire. Today's meeting in Chicago could determine whether she would step out of her father's shadow or remain forever defined by his legacy. The navy blazer hanging on her bedroom door had been chosen with surgical precision, expensive enough to command respect, but not so flashy as to invite resentment from the board members who still whispered about nepotism whenever they thought she couldn't hear. She slipped it on, adjusting the cuffs with the same methodical attention her father had taught her to apply to everything that mattered, which was everything. Her phone buzzed against the marble countertop, the sound sharp in the quiet apartment. Jonathan Chen never wasted words, especially not in messages that mattered. Remember who you are, document everything, stay calm. Victoria smiled despite the flutter of nervousness in her chest, recognizing the advice that had guided her through every important moment since childhood. The weight of expectation felt heavier this morning than usual, partly because she knew that walking into that Chicago boardroom as the chief operating officer of Chen Technologies meant walking into a room where some people would be looking for reasons to doubt her abilities before she even opened her mouth. Her father had warned her about this, not with bitterness, but with the practical wisdom of someone who had learned to navigate similar waters for 30 years. Victoria picked up her phone and opened the recording app, testing the microphone levels and checking the cloud storage settings with the same thoroughness she applied to everything else. This wasn't paranoia, it was preparation, the kind of habit that her father had drilled into her since she was old enough to understand that the world didn't always play fair, and that protection often came from having proof of what actually happened versus what people claimed had happened. The view from her window stretched across Elliott Bay to the Olympic Mountains, a reminder of how far her family had traveled from the tiny apartment in the International District where her father had started writing code on a second-hand computer. That journey had required more than talent. It had demanded an almost supernatural level of persistence and the ability to document every slight, every barrier, every moment when doors were closed for reasons that had nothing to do with qualifications. As Victoria gathered her laptop bag and checked her boarding pass one final time, she felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and wariness that accompanied any situation where she would be representing not just herself but her father's company, and whether she liked it or not. Everyone who looked like her in an industry that still treated diversity as an occasional talking point rather than a business imperative. Seattle-Tacoma International Airport hummed with the controlled chaos of early morning departures, travelers moving through security lines with the practiced efficiency of people who had learned to treat air travel as just another part of their routine, rather than the small miracle of engineering and logistics it actually represented. Victoria approached the premium check-in counter with her confirmation number already pulled up on her phone. The first-class ticket to Chicago representing both a necessary comfort for the long day ahead and a symbol of the success her family had worked so hard to achieve. The agent behind the counter, a middle-aged woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and a smile that seemed painted on with the same precision as her makeup, glanced at Victoria's phone screen and then looked up with an expression that shifted almost imperceptibly from professional courtesy to something more guarded. First class to Chicago. Victoria said, sliding her driver's license across the counter with the same calm confidence she had learned to project in every professional interaction. The woman took the license and stared at it for several seconds longer than necessary, her fingers drumming against the counter in a rhythm that suggested she was thinking about something other than processing a routine ticket upgrade. Behind Victoria, a white man in his 50s approached the counter next to her, wearing a navy windbreaker and carrying a worn leather briefcase that suggested years of business travel. "Good morning, sir," the agent at the adjacent counter said, her voice warm and welcoming in a way that created an immediate contrast with the cooler tone Victoria was receiving. "How can I help you today?" The man's boarding pass was scanned and processed within 30 seconds, accompanied by cheerful comments about the weather and wishes for a pleasant flight that seemed to flow naturally from someone genuinely happy to assist a valued customer. Victoria noticed the difference because she had been trained to notice such things not out of paranoia, but out of the practical reality that small disparities in treatment often served as early warning signs of larger problems that could be avoided if you recognized the patterns quickly enough. The agent finally handed back her identification and boarding pass, but not before asking, "And how did you purchase this ticket?" in a tone that suggested she was following some kind of protocol that hadn't been applied to the passenger who had just been processed with such efficiency. Through the Airline app, Victoria replied, her voice remaining even, despite the slight tightening she felt in her chest. The question itself wasn't unreasonable, but the fact that it was being asked at all, combined with the extended examination of her identification and the contrast with how other passengers were being treated, created a pattern that felt both familiar and unwelcome. The agent typed something into her computer, her nails clicking against the keys with more force than seemed necessary for routine data entry. "It's quite an expensive ticket," she said, not looking up from her screen. Victoria waited for the comment to develop into an actual question, but when none came, she simply nodded and waited for the process to continue. "Boarding begins in about 40 minutes. The agent said, finally, handing over the boarding pass with a smile that looked more like a facial exercise than an expression of genuine customer service. Victoria thanked her and turned toward security, pulling out her phone to note the time and basic details of the interaction, in the same way her father had taught her to document anything that felt even slightly off. The security checkpoint provided another small test of patience, as Victoria found herself selected for additional screening, despite having both clear membership and TSA pre-check status that should have expedited the process considerably. The additional pat-down was conducted professionally but thoroughly, taking place in full view of other passengers who were moving through the standard metal detectors with minimal delay. "Just a routine random selection," the TSA agent explained, though Victoria noticed that the randomness seemed to have skipped over the dozen or so travelers who had passed through immediately before and after her. She submitted to the additional screening without complaint, recognizing that arguing would accomplish nothing except potentially creating a scene that could be used to justify even more intrusive treatment. By the time Victoria reached the gate area, she had collected enough small incidents to fill half a page in her phone's notes app, each one individually defensible but collectively forming a pattern that felt as familiar as it was frustrating. The gate agent, a woman named Beverly Walsh, according to her name tag, greeted her with the same professional politeness she seemed to offer everyone, though Victoria couldn't shake the feeling that the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Beverly Walsh had been working for Horizon Airlines for 15 years, long enough to develop strong opinions about passengers who she believed were trying to get more than they deserved, and short enough to remember when air travel still felt like something special rather than a daily grind of complaints, delays, and people who seemed to think that buying a ticket entitled them to treatment she would never receive in her own life. When first-class boarding was announced, she watched the line form with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to spot trouble before it had a chance to develop into the kind of incident that required paperwork and explanations to supervisors who never seemed to have enough time to hear the full story. Victoria approached with her boarding pass ready and her phone tucked into her jacket pocket where it could record without being obvious, a precaution that felt more necessary with each passing minute of what should have been a routine travel experience. Beverly scanned the pass and looked at Victoria with an expression that seemed to contain more evaluation than a simple ticket verification should require. "Seat 2. Beverly said, her voice carrying none of the warmth that Victoria had heard her use with the passengers immediately ahead in line. That's in the front of first class. The comment hung in the air like a question that hadn't been asked directly, creating a moment of awkward silence that several other passengers seemed to notice. Yes, Victoria replied simply, seeing no reason to elaborate on what was already clearly stated on the boarding pass that had just been scanned successfully. Beverly stepped aside to let her pass, but not before giving her one more long look that felt more like an assessment than anything related to customer service. Inside the aircraft, the first-class cabin offered the kind of comfort that Victoria rarely indulged in but appreciated when business required long flights and productive work time during travel. She stowed her laptop bag in the overhead compartment and settled into her seat, noticing that the flight attendant who had been enthusiastically welcoming other passengers seemed to have suddenly become very busy with tasks that didn't involve making eye contact. When beverage service began, Victoria found herself receiving a plastic cup, while passengers around her were offered glassware, a small detail that might have gone unnoticed if it hadn't been part of an ongoing pattern of treatment that seemed designed to make her feel like she didn't quite belong in the space she had paid to occupy. She accepted the plastic cup without comment, but made another note in her phone, building a record that was becoming more detailed with each passing minute. Beverly Walsh moved through the cabin with the efficiency of someone who had performed these same tasks thousands of times, but Victoria noticed that her efficiency seemed to increase dramatically when she was serving passengers who looked like they belonged in first class, and decreased noticeably when she reached Victoria's row. The difference wasn't dramatic enough to cause a scene, but it was consistent enough to feel deliberate. "Ma'am, I need to see your identification again," Beverly said, appearing beside Victoria's seat with a handheld device that looked official enough to justify almost any request. Victoria looked up from her laptop where she had been reviewing notes for the Chicago meeting and felt the first real spike of irritation she had allowed herself to acknowledge all morning. "I showed my identification at the gate," Victoria said, keeping her voice calm despite the fact that no other passenger had been subjected to this level of ongoing verification. And again at the ticket counter. Beverly's jaw tightened slightly, suggesting that she didn't appreciate having her procedures questioned even politely. "It's routine procedure," Beverly replied, though the routine seemed to be remarkably selective in its application. Victoria handed over her driver's license again, watching as Beverly examined it with the same suspicious attention she had received at the check-in counter, as if there was something about her presence in first class that required ongoing confirmation rather than simple acceptance. Across the aisle, David Brooks had been watching the interaction with growing discomfort, recognizing the kind of treatment he had witnessed in boardrooms and business meetings where certain people seemed to face different standards without anyone ever explicitly acknowledging the disparity. He leaned slightly toward Victoria after Beverly moved away and spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. "You're seeing this too, right?" he asked, his voice carrying the kind of careful diplomacy that came from years of navigating corporate environments where stating the obvious could sometimes be more dangerous than pretending not to notice. Victoria nodded without turning her head, appreciating the validation while recognizing that having a witness might become important if the situation continued to escalate. Beverly returned to the galley area where she spoke in hushed tones with another flight attendant, their conversation accompanied by glances in Victoria's direction that were frequent enough to be noticed by several passengers, but subtle enough to maintain some degree of plausible deniability. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted from the usual pre-flight calm to something more tense, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen without quite knowing what that something might be. When Beverly approached Victoria's seat for the third time carrying a different device and wearing an expression that suggested her patience was running thin, Victoria reached into her jacket pocket and activated the recording app on her phone, a precaution that felt both necessary and deeply unwelcome in what should have been a routine business flight. The aircraft door sealed with the heavy mechanical thunk that usually signaled the beginning of a journey, but for Victoria Chen it felt more like the closing of a trap she hadn't seen being set around her. Beverly Walsh stood in the aisle near the front of first class. her posture rigid with the kind of authority that flight attendants wielded within the confined space of an aircraft cabin where their word carried the weight of federal aviation regulations and passenger compliance was not just expected, but legally required. "Ma'am, I need you to come with me," Beverly said, her voice carrying across the quiet cabin with enough force that conversations stopped and heads turned in Victoria's direction. "There's an issue with your boarding that needs to be resolved before departure." The phrasing was carefully neutral, the kind of language that sounded official enough to justify almost any request while remaining vague enough to avoid specific accusations that could be challenged. Victoria felt her pulse quicken, but kept her expression calm as she looked up at Beverly, recognizing that this moment would likely determine how the rest of the situation unfolded. What kind of issue, she asked, her voice steady despite the fact that every instinct was telling her that leaving her seat would be a mistake that she might not be able to recover from. "The captain needs to speak with you privately," Beverly replied, though the captain had not appeared and showed no signs of emerging from the cockpit to participate in whatever conversation was allegedly required. "It will only take a few minutes, and then you can return to your seat and we can continue with departure." David Brooks shifted in his seat across the aisle, clearly uncomfortable with what he was witnessing, but uncertain about whether passenger-to-passenger intervention would help or hurt the situation. Around the cabin, other first-class passengers watched with the kind of careful attention that people paid to uncomfortable situations they hoped would resolve themselves without requiring any action on their part. "I'd prefer that any conversation happen here," Victoria said, recognizing that the aircraft represented a controlled environment where everything was potentially being recorded and witnessed, while wherever Beverly wanted to take her would offer far fewer protections and much less oversight. "I haven't done anything that requires private discussion." Beverly's facade of professional courtesy cracked slightly, revealing something harder and more personal underneath. "Ma'am, you can either come with me voluntarily, or I can have security escort you off this aircraft," she said, her voice rising just enough that the threat carried to every corner of the first-class cabin. "I'm trying to handle this discreetly, but that's your choice." The implicit accusation hung in the air like smoke, creating the suggestion that Victoria had done something wrong without ever specifying what that something might be. It was a masterful piece of manipulation designed to make compliance seem reasonable and resistance appear suspicious. But Victoria recognized the technique because her father had taught her to spot it in business negotiations where people used authority and implied consequences to avoid having to justify their positions with actual facts. "I'll speak with the captain," Victoria said carefully, "but I'd like to know what this is regarding before we go anywhere." She kept her voice calm and reasonable, speaking loudly enough that her words would carry to the other passengers who were watching this unfold with increasing interest and discomfort. Beverly's expression hardened further, suggesting that she was not accustomed to having her authority questioned even politely and reasonably. "Ma'am, you're being disruptive," she said, employing the kind of circular logic that defined the behavior of complaining about it as the real problem. "Please gather your belongings and come with me now." Victoria remained seated, her hand resting near her phone where the recording app continued to capture every word of an interaction that was rapidly moving beyond anything that could be explained as routine passenger service. Around the cabin, the tension was becoming thick enough that even passengers who had been trying to mind their own business were now openly watching a situation that seemed to be escalating toward something no one wanted to witness. "I haven't been disruptive," Victoria said, her voice carrying clearly throughout the cabin. "I've answered your questions, provided identification multiple times, and complied with every reasonable request." The word reasonable hung in the air with just enough emphasis to suggest that the current situation was moving beyond that category. Beverly's face flushed red with a combination of embarrassment and anger that made it clear this confrontation had become personal in a way that had nothing to do with airline procedures or passenger safety. "Fine," she snapped, turning sharply toward the aircraft door. "We'll discuss this outside, where we won't disturb other passengers." The implication was clear away from witnesses, away from the relative protection of public scrutiny in a space where Beverly's authority would be absolute, and Victoria's ability to document or resist would be severely limited. As Victoria stood slowly and gathered her jacket, she felt the weight of every eye in the cabin, and the knowledge that whatever happened next would determine not just the course of her day, but possibly much more than that. The jetway felt colder than the aircraft cabin, with aluminum walls that seemed to amplify every sound and create an echo chamber that made even normal conversation feel more intense and confrontational than it would in an open space. Victoria followed Beverly Walsh down the sloped walkway, her phone still recording in her jacket pocket, capturing every footstep and every word of what she hoped would remain a conversation rather than escalating into something more serious. Beverly stopped halfway down the jetway and turned to face Victoria with an expression that had moved completely beyond customer service into something much more personal and hostile. "You people always think you can humiliate me in front of everyone," she said, her voice carrying the kind of resentment that suggested this confrontation was about far more than boarding procedures or airline policies. "Do you know how hard I've worked for this job?" Victoria took a step backward, recognizing that the situation had shifted into dangerous territory, where Beverly's anger was being directed at her personally rather than at any specific action she had taken. "I didn't try to humiliate anyone," Victoria said, keeping her voice calm despite the fact that adrenaline was now flooding her circulation with the sharp clarity that came from recognizing genuine danger. "I just asked for equal treatment." "Equal?" Beverly laughed, the sound bitter and harsh in the confined space of the jetway. "You waltz in here acting like you own the place, questioning everything I do, making me look incompetent in front of passengers and crew." Her voice was rising with each word, echoing off the metal walls in a way that made her anger seem even more intense and unpredictable. Victoria could feel her heart beating faster as she realized that Beverly's rage had moved beyond anything that could be addressed with calm responses or reasonable discussion. "I paid for my seat like everyone else," Victoria said, trying to maintain some kind of dialogue that might diffuse the situation before it escalated further. "That's all I'm asking for." "You got me reprimanded," Beverly snapped, stepping closer in a way that felt threatening rather than conversational. "Made me look like some kind of racist in front of my supervisor, in front of passengers, in front of crew members I have to work with every day." The accusation was delivered with the kind of fury that suggested Beverly genuinely believed she was the victim of the situation rather than the cause of it. "Your behavior did that," Victoria replied, the words coming out with more force than she had intended, but carrying the weight of frustration that had been building throughout the morning's series of incidents. "I didn't make you treat me differently from other passengers." The response hit Beverly like a physical blow, her face flushing an even deeper red as she absorbed the implication that her actions had been wrong rather than justified. For a moment, she stood perfectly still, hands clenched into fists at her sides, breathing heavily through her nose like someone trying to control rage that was threatening to overwhelm her completely. "Don't you dare!" Beverly said, her voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more frightening than her earlier shouting. "Don't you dare stand there and lecture me about behavior." She took another step forward, close enough now that Victoria could see the hatred burning in her eyes, raw and unfiltered by any pretense of professionalism. Victoria instinctively moved backward, but the jetway's slope worked against her, making it difficult to maintain her balance while trying to create distance from someone who was clearly on the edge of losing control completely. "Beverly, please," she said, trying to use the woman's name to create some kind of personal connection that might pull her back from whatever precipice she was approaching. The sound of her own name seemed to snap something inside Beverly Walsh, as if hearing it spoken aloud by someone she saw as beneath her was the final insult she could tolerate. Her hands shot forward, slamming into Victoria's shoulders with enough force to send her stumbling backward down the sloped walkway, arms windmilling desperately as she tried to catch her balance on surfaces that offered no grip or support. Victoria's body hit the metal railing with a sound like a gunshot, the impact driving the air from her lungs and sending shock waves of pain through her ribs and spine. She bounced off the railing and continued falling, her head striking the aluminum floor with a sickening crack that echoed through the jetway like the sound of something breaking that could never be repaired. For a moment that felt like eternity. Everything was silent except for the ringing in Victoria's ears and the sound of her own breathing, which seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden stillness that followed the violence. She could taste blood in her mouth and feel wetness on her forehead where her skin had split against the metal flooring, warm and sticky against the cold air of the jetway. Above her, Beverly stood frozen, her hands still extended from the shove, her face a mask of shock and dawning horror as she realized what she had done and what the consequences might be. She slipped. Beverly said aloud, though there was no one else in the jetway to hear the lie. I tried to catch her, but she slipped. Victoria lay still for several seconds, not because she was unable to move, but because she needed time to assess the damage and gather her thoughts enough to respond appropriately to what had just happened. Through the pain and disorientation, one thought cut through everything else with crystal clarity. Her phone was still recording, and whatever happened next would determine whether this moment became just another buried incident or something that could create real change. "You pushed me," Victoria said, clearly her voice carrying despite the fact that she was lying on the cold metal floor with blood running down her face. "And my phone is recording everything." The words hit Beverly Walsh like a second physical blow, her face going pale as the implications crashed over her with the weight of an avalanche. She stood motionless, watching as Victoria slowly pushed herself up to a sitting position, one hand pressed against the cut on her forehead, the other reaching for the phone that would document everything that had just transpired in this cold metal corridor where no one was supposed to be watching. David Brooks had his phone out before he consciously decided to use it, the marketing executive's instincts for documentation kicking in as soon as he heard the sound of impact echoing from the jetway through the aircraft's open door. He pushed past the other first-class passengers who were standing in the aisle trying to see what had happened, his phone already recording as he stepped into the jetway, and found Victoria Chen sitting on the metal floor with blood streaming down her face while Beverly Walsh stood above her mouth opening and closing, like someone who had forgotten how to speak. "What happened here?" David asked, though his phone was already capturing evidence of what had clearly been more than an accident given the distance between where Beverly stood and where Victoria was sitting. The angry red marks on Victoria's jacket, where hands had grabbed and pushed, and the look of pure panic in Beverly's eyes as she realized she was being recorded by someone who had witnessed the aftermath of her assault. She slipped. Beverly said automatically, the lie sounding hollow even to her own ears as she repeated it like a mantra that might somehow change reality if she said it enough times. I tried to catch her, but she was moving too fast down the slope. Her voice was shaking now, all pretense of authority or control completely abandoned, as the magnitude of what she had done began to sink in. Victoria looked up at David with eyes that were clear despite the blood on her face, her mind sharp even through the pain and shock of what had just happened. "Did you see her push me?" she asked, knowing that witness testimony would be crucial in whatever followed, assuming that anyone would be willing to tell the truth about what they had observed rather than finding reasons to look the other way. "I heard the impact," David replied carefully, still recording as he spoke. "And I saw you on the ground with her standing over you." He paused, looking directly at Beverly, whose face had gone completely white as she realized that her version of events was already being contradicted by someone who had no reason to lie. "That doesn't look like someone who tried to catch a falling passenger." Other passengers had begun emerging from the aircraft, drawn by the commotion and the sound of voices raised in distress, their faces showing the kind of shocked confusion that people displayed when the normal order of things collapsed suddenly and violently in front of them. A flight attendant appeared behind them, her expression shifting from annoyance at the delay to horror as she took in the scene of Victoria bleeding on the jetway floor while Beverly stood frozen in obvious guilt. "We need medical assistance," David said, addressing the flight attendant while keeping his phone trained on the scene, documenting everything with the thoroughness of someone who understood that video evidence would be far more powerful than any written report or second-hand account. And security. This wasn't an accident. Beverly finally found her voice again, though it came out as more of a whimper than the authoritative tone she had been using just minutes earlier. "This is all a misunderstanding," she said, looking around at the growing crowd of witnesses as if she could somehow convince them all to forget what they had seen or heard. "I was trying to help her maintain her balance on the slope." Victoria pressed her hand against the cut on her forehead, feeling the warmth of blood against her palm, while her other hand retrieved her phone from her jacket pocket. The screen showing that the recording app had captured everything from the initial confrontation through the assault and its immediate aftermath. "The recording will show exactly what happened," she said, her voice steady, despite the pain and the surreal nature of having to defend herself while sitting on a metal floor with her own blood on her face. The crowd of passengers had grown larger, some holding their own phones as they documented the scene. Their faces showing a mixture of shock, anger, and the kind of uncomfortable recognition that came from witnessing something they had always known was possible, but hoped they would never have to see firsthand. Someone in the back called for airport security while another passenger was already on the phone with what sounded like emergency medical services. David Brooks continued recording as he knelt beside Victoria, offering her his jacket to press against the cut on her forehead while keeping his phone positioned to capture Beverly's increasingly frantic attempts to control a situation that had already spiraled completely beyond her ability to manage. "Are you okay to move?" he asked Victoria quietly, though he made sure his voice was loud enough for the phone to pick up her response. "I think so," Victoria replied, accepting the jacket and pressing it against her forehead, where the bleeding was beginning to slow, but had not yet stopped completely. "But I'm not going anywhere until security gets here and documents what happened." She looked directly at Beverly, whose panic was now visible to everyone present. "This doesn't get swept under anyone's carpet." Beverly Walsh stared at the crowd of passengers at the phones, recording her every word and expression at the evidence of her assault bleeding on the jetway floor, and finally understood that her 15-year career with Horizon Airlines had just ended in the most public and devastating way possible. "I never meant for this to happen," she said, though the words sounded more like a confession than an explanation. "But you did mean to push me," Victoria said, her voice carrying clearly to every phone and every witness present in the jetway. "And now everyone knows what that looks like when someone with power decides that someone else doesn't deserve basic human respect." The sound of running footsteps echoed from the terminal as airport security and medical personnel rushed toward the scene, their arrival marking the moment when the incident officially became something that would have to be explained, documented, investigated, and ultimately answered for by people whose names and faces were already being shared across social media platforms where justice moved faster than corporate damage control. Jonathan Chen's phone vibrated against the polished surface of his desk 3 times before he looked away from the quarterly revenue projections that had been demanding his attention for the past hour. The numbers representing the kind of incremental growth that built empires but rarely generated headlines or required immediate action. The message notification showed Victoria's name with a video attachment and no accompanying text, which immediately triggered the parental alarm system that every father developed when their children reached the age where silence often meant trouble. He opened the video without hesitation, expecting perhaps a delayed flight announcement or travel update, but instead finding himself watching his daughter's face covered in blood while a flight attendant stood over her in what was clearly the aftermath of some kind of confrontation. The sound quality was clear enough to pick up every word of the conversation that followed, including Victoria's calm statement that her phone was recording everything, and by the time the video ended, Jonathan Chen had transformed from concerned father to something far more focused and dangerous. The intercom on his desk buzzed before he could fully process the implications of what he had just witnessed. "Mr. Chen, there are several urgent calls holding Patricia Evans," said her voice carrying the kind of controlled urgency that suggested she already knew that something significant had happened. "Hospital legal department and someone from Horizon Airline's corporate office." Jonathan stood slowly, his mind already shifting into the strategic mode that had carried him through 30 years of building a technology empire while black in an industry that had spent most of those 3 decades suggesting that people who looked like him were better suited for other types of work. "Get Sandra Kim and Michael Torres in here immediately," he said, referring to Chen Technologies' chief legal counsel and director of public affairs, "and book my jet for Seattle departure within 2 hours." "Sir?" "What should I tell the callers?" Patricia asked, though her tone suggested she already understood that whatever had happened was serious enough to require the full attention of senior executives who normally dealt with quarterly board meetings rather than emergency crisis management. "Tell Horizon Airlines that they'll be hearing from our legal team," Jonathan replied, his voice carrying the kind of calm that people who knew him well recognized as far more dangerous than any amount of shouting or emotional display. "Tell the hospital I'm on my way. And tell Sandra and Michael that we have a situation that requires immediate and comprehensive response." The Seattle office of Chen Technologies erupted into controlled chaos within 15 minutes of Jonathan's call with senior staff members, canceling meetings and rearranging schedules to accommodate what was clearly a crisis that demanded immediate and total attention from everyone involved. Sandra Kim arrived first, her expression shifting from professional concern to genuine shock as Jonathan played the video for her without commentary, letting the evidence speak for itself in terms that no legal training could soften or rationalize. "This is assault," Sandra said flatly, pausing the video at the moment when Beverly Walsh's hands were clearly visible, pushing Victoria backward down the jetway slope. "Battery discrimination violation of federal transportation safety regulations, and probably a dozen other charges depending on how thoroughly we want to pursue this." Her voice carried the kind of controlled anger that came from recognizing injustice that was both personally offensive and professionally actionable. Michael Torres entered the office as Sandra was speaking his public affairs background, immediately obvious in the way he processed the situation, not just in terms of legal liability, but also in terms of narrative control and media management. "How widespread is this already?" he asked, pulling out his phone to check social media platforms where stories like this could go viral before traditional news organizations even became aware of their existence. "David Brooks posted a witness video 30 minutes ago," Jonathan replied, showing them the social media post that was already generating thousands of shares and comments, the witness footage providing corroboration for Victoria's recording and eliminating any possibility that the incident could be dismissed as a misunderstanding or exaggeration. No commentary, just raw footage, but it's spreading faster than airline damage control can contain it. Sandra was already taking notes, her legal mind automatically organizing the evidence and potential charges into categories that could support both criminal prosecution and civil litigation. "We'll want medical documentation, witness statements, copies of all recordings, and a comprehensive timeline of the discrimination that led up to the assault," she said, speaking with the methodical precision of someone who understood that cases like this were won or lost based on the quality of documentation and preparation, rather than the emotional impact of the story. "They'll offer a settlement." Michael said his experience with corporate crisis management providing insight into how companies typically responded when caught in situations that could generate significant public relations damage. "Probably within 24 hours, certainly before this gets picked up by national news organizations or triggers any kind of federal investigation." Jonathan looked at both of them with an expression that made it clear He had already made fundamental decisions about how this situation would be handled. "There will be no settlement," he said, his voice carrying the kind of absolute certainty that comes from having clear principles and the resources to defend them regardless of the cost or complexity involved. "This doesn't end with money and silence." The room fell quiet as the implications of that statement settled over everyone present, because rejecting settlement offers meant accepting the risks and uncertainties of public legal proceedings, media attention, and corporate retaliation that could extend far beyond the immediate incident to affect business relationships and future opportunities in ways that were difficult to predict or control. Sir Sandra said carefully, "Taking on a major airline in federal court is a significant undertaking that could take years to resolve and generate substantial legal costs regardless of the outcome." Her tone was respectful but clear about the realities of litigation against well-funded corporate defendants who could afford to drag proceedings out indefinitely. Jonathan walked to the windows of his office, looking out at the Seattle skyline that represented both his success and the ongoing responsibility he felt to use that success in ways that created opportunities for people who were still facing the same barriers he had encountered decades earlier. 30 years ago, a security guard escorted me out of a meeting I had designed and pitched because no one believed I could be the lead engineer. He said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly to everyone in the room. I took their apologies and their explanations and their promises to do better, and I told myself that was enough, because I was afraid that demanding more would cost me everything I had worked to achieve. He turned back to face Sandra and Michael, his expression resolute in a way that made it clear this conversation was about far more than one incident on one aircraft. "My daughter will not accept their apologies and promises because we have something now that I didn't have then." "What's that?" Sir Michael asked, though his tone suggested he already understood the direction this was heading. "The ability to make them keep their promises," Jonathan replied, already reaching for his jacket as Patricia's voice came through the intercom, announcing that the jet was ready for departure. "And the platform to make sure everyone knows whether they do or not." The 37th floor of Horizon Airlines' corporate headquarters in Chicago felt like the inside of a pressure cooker that was rapidly approaching the point where something explosive was going to happen, with executives moving through hallways with the kind of forced urgency that people displayed when they were trying very hard to look like they had everything under control while having absolutely no idea what to do next. Richard Hayes, the company's chief executive officer, stood at the head of a conference table surrounded by empty coffee cups and the scattered papers of crisis management plans that had been designed for mechanical failures and weather delays rather than viral videos of employee assault that were currently trending on 3 different social media platforms. "How bad is this?" Richard asked for the 4th time in 20 minutes. Though the question was becoming more rhetorical with each repetition, as the answers continued to get worse instead of better. The head of public relations, a woman named Jennifer Walsh, who had the unfortunate coincidence of sharing a last name with the flight attendant who had created this disaster, looked up from her phone with the expression of someone who was watching her professional reputation crumble in real time. 17,000 shares in the first hour. Jennifer reported, her voice carrying the kind of careful neutrality that public relations professionals used when delivering news that was going to make everyone in the room angry. "Major news outlets are picking it up. Congressional staff are making informal inquiries, and our stock is down 8% since the video went live." She paused, checking her phone again as new notifications continued to arrive faster than she could process them. "And we're getting reports of similar incidents from passengers who are now coming forward with their own stories." The head of human resources, a nervous man named Robert Harrison, shuffled through a thick folder of documents with the same expression that people wore when they were looking for something they hoped they wouldn't find but suspected was definitely there. "Beverly Walsh has 17 complaints in her personnel file," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the hum of air conditioning that suddenly seemed unnaturally loud in the silence that followed his announcement. 17, Richard's voice rose sharply, suggesting that this was the first time he was hearing about the extent of Beverly's disciplinary history. How does someone with 17 complaints continue working for this company without anyone flagging her as a problem employee? Robert's face flushed red as he realized that he was about to become the next target of executive anger that was looking for someone to blame for a situation that had grown far beyond any individual employee's ability to create or contain. The complaints were handled through our standard internal process, he said, reading from notes that suddenly seemed inadequate for explaining how such an obvious pattern had been allowed to continue unchecked. Verbal warnings, additional training, performance improvement plans. But no actual consequences, said Angela Foster, the only person of color on Horizon's board of directors, and someone who had been raising concerns about the company's diversity and inclusion practices for years, without receiving the kind of attention that was suddenly being paid to every aspect of company policy. No suspension, no termination, no real accountability for behavior that was clearly escalating toward exactly what happened today. The legal department's representative, a sharp-faced woman named Catherine Moore, looked up from her laptop where she had been reviewing federal transportation regulations and civil rights statutes with increasing alarm. "We're looking at potential violations of multiple federal laws," she said, her voice carrying the kind of professional detachment that lawyers used when discussing catastrophic legal exposure. Discrimination, assault violations of passenger safety regulations, and potentially criminal charges depending on how aggressively prosecutors decide to pursue this. Richard Hayes sank into his chair with the expression of someone who was beginning to understand that this crisis was not going to be resolved with the standard corporate playbook of apologies, internal investigations, and carefully worded statements that accepted responsibility without admitting liability. "What are our options?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected that the available options were all variations of damage control rather than actual solutions. "We could offer a settlement," Catherine said, consulting her notes about similar cases and their typical resolution patterns. "Substantial financial compensation, public apology agreement to implement additional training and oversight procedures." She paused, looking around the table at executives whose faces showed varying degrees of hope that this suggestion might provide a way out of their current predicament. "But that only works if the other party is willing to accept confidentiality agreements." Angela Foster leaned forward with an expression that suggested she had been waiting for exactly this moment to make a point she had been trying to make for years. "Chen Technologies is not going to accept a confidential settlement," she said, her voice carrying the kind of certainty that came from understanding the people and principles involved better than anyone else in the room. "Jonathan Chen has spent 30 years building a platform specifically to challenge companies that try to buy their way out of accountability." The room fell silent as the implications of that statement settled over everyone present, because if Chen Technologies was unwilling to accept monetary settlement and confidentiality agreements, then Horizon Airlines was looking at a prolonged public battle with opponents who had both the resources and the motivation to pursue the fight regardless of cost or complexity. "Then what do they want?" Richard asked, though his tone suggested he was afraid to hear the answer. Angela pulled out her phone and showed the table a statement that had just been released by Chen Technologies' Media Relations Department. "Comprehensive policy reform, independent oversight of discrimination, complaints, public reporting of disciplinary actions, and federal legislation requiring airlines to meet measurable standards for equitable treatment of passengers." She looked around the table at faces that were rapidly losing color as they processed the scope of demands that went far beyond any individual incident. "They want to change how the entire industry operates." Jennifer Walsh looked up from her phone where she had been monitoring social media response and news coverage with growing alarm. "This just got picked up by CNN and NBC," she announced, her voice carrying the kind of professional calm that public relations professionals maintained even while watching disasters unfold in real time. "And there are reports that the Department of Transportation is opening a preliminary investigation." Richard Hayes stood slowly walking to the windows that looked out over the Chicago skyline, while his executive team continued discussing legal strategies and damage control options that were becoming more limited with each passing hour. "How long do we have before this becomes a federal case?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer would not be encouraging. "Based on similar incidents and current political climate around transportation equity," Catherine replied after consulting her legal databases, "probably 48 to 72 hours before formal federal involvement becomes unavoidable." She paused, looking directly at Richard with the kind of professional honesty that lawyers provided when situations moved beyond standard corporate legal strategies. And once that happens, settlement negotiations become much more complicated because federal agencies have their own requirements for resolution. Angela Foster closed her folder and looked around the table at colleagues who were still thinking in terms of damage control rather than fundamental change. "We have one option that might prevent this from destroying the company," she said, her voice cutting through the growing panic with the kind of clarity that comes from having anticipated exactly this kind of crisis. "We implement the changes they're demanding voluntarily immediately and publicly before anyone forces us to do it." The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge that everyone in the room understood, but no one wanted to acknowledge because voluntary implementation of comprehensive reform would require admitting that the current practices had been wrong all along, while also accepting costs and oversight that would fundamentally alter how the company had been operating for decades. The Department of Transportation's investigation unit occupied 3 floors of a glass building in Washington, D.C., where career civil servants spent their days reviewing safety regulations, maintenance records, and compliance reports that most travelers never thought about, but which determined whether flights arrived safely and on schedule. Sarah Martinez had been investigating transportation discrimination cases for 8 years, long enough to recognize patterns that companies thought they had hidden and develop instincts for finding evidence that corporations preferred to keep buried in internal databases and personnel files that were never intended for public review. When the Victoria Chen assault video reached her desk through the department's incident reporting system, Sarah immediately recognized that this case represented something more significant than an isolated employee discipline problem, partly because of the clear documentation, but mostly because of the pattern of behavior that was already emerging from preliminary witness interviews and social media reports. She opened a new case file and began the methodical process of requesting records that would reveal whether Beverly Walsh's actions represented individual misconduct or something larger and more concerning. Horizon Airline's initial response to the federal records request had been predictably cautious, providing the minimum documentation required by law while arguing that employee personnel files contained sensitive information that should remain confidential to protect privacy rights. Sarah had seen this strategy countless times before, and knew that it usually indicated companies were trying to hide evidence that would contradict their public statements about isolated incidents and rogue employees. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source when Maria Rodriguez, a former Horizon Human Resources manager, contacted Sarah's office through the federal whistleblower reporting system with an offer to provide internal documents that she had copied before leaving the company 6 months earlier. Maria's motivation was partly professional conscience and partly personal experience, since she had been pressured to reclassify discrimination complaints as customer service issues whenever the complaints might generate legal liability for the company. "They called it complaint management," Maria explained during a recorded interview in Sarah's office, her voice steady, despite the obvious nervousness that came from providing testimony that could end her career in the airline industry. Any complaint that mentioned race, gender, or religion was automatically flagged for reclassification as a customer service misunderstanding unless there was physical injury or video evidence that couldn't be disputed. Sarah reviewed the documents that Maria had provided, finding a pattern of complaint handling that was both comprehensive and carefully designed to avoid federal oversight while maintaining plausible deniability about discriminatory treatment of passengers. Beverly Walsh's name appeared in 17 separate incident reports over 5 years, with complaints ranging from verbal harassment to inappropriate physical contact. but none of the reports had been forwarded to federal agencies as required by transportation discrimination regulations. What happened to employees who filed these reports? Sarah asked, taking careful notes that would become part of an official federal investigation with the potential to trigger criminal charges and civil penalties that could reach into the millions of dollars. Maria shifted in her chair, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was heading, but committed to providing complete and accurate testimony, regardless of the personal cost. Some were transferred to different positions, some were laid off during cost reduction programs, and some were subjected to performance improvement plans that made their jobs impossible to perform successfully, she said. The message was clear: if you created problems for management, management would create problems for you. The documentation that Maria provided showed a deliberate corporate strategy of protecting problematic employees when terminating them would require acknowledging patterns of discrimination that could trigger federal investigations and legal liability. Beverly Walsh had been retained despite multiple complaints, because firing her would have required explaining why someone with such an extensive disciplinary record had been allowed to continue working in customer service roles where her behavior affected passengers who had rights under federal transportation laws. Sarah spent the next week interviewing former employees, reviewing complaint records, and analyzing corporate policies that were designed to minimize legal liability rather than prevent discriminatory treatment of passengers. The picture that emerged was one of institutional indifference to discrimination complaints and active resistance to federal oversight through techniques that were technically legal but clearly contrary to the spirit of transportation equity regulations. This goes far beyond Beverly Walsh, Sarah told her supervisor during a briefing that would determine whether the investigation expanded to include corporate executives and board members who had overseen policies that enabled discrimination to flourish unchecked. We're looking at corporate practices that were designed to hide discrimination rather than prevent it, which suggests willful violation of federal transportation laws rather than simple negligence or inadequate training. The supervisor, a career federal attorney named James Patterson, who had been investigating transportation cases since before Sarah was born, reviewed the evidence with the methodical attention that came from 30 years of building federal cases against companies that preferred settlement negotiations to compliance with federal law. "How strong is the documentation?" he asked, understanding that federal transportation cases required evidence that could withstand corporate legal challenges in federal court, where companies could afford to hire the best defense attorneys available. "Strong enough to support criminal charges," Sarah replied, opening her laptop to show James the internal Horizon emails that revealed corporate executives discussing how to minimize legal exposure from discrimination complaints without actually addressing the underlying behavior that generated those complaints, and comprehensive enough to demonstrate patterns that go back years rather than isolated incidents that could be attributed to individual employee misconduct. James reviewed the email chain that showed Horizon executives explicitly discussing how to handle discrimination complaints in ways that would avoid federal reporting requirements while protecting employees whose behavior was generating ongoing legal liability for the company. "This is conspiracy to violate federal transportation laws," he said, his voice carrying the kind of professional excitement that federal prosecutors displayed when discovering evidence that could support charges with serious prison time attached. "What's our next step?" Sarah asked, though she already understood that federal investigations of this magnitude required coordination with multiple agencies and approval from senior Justice Department officials who would determine whether the evidence was strong enough to justify the resources and political attention that high-profile transportation cases typically generated. James closed his laptop and reached for his phone, already planning the conversations with federal prosecutors who would determine whether this case remained a civil enforcement action or expanded into criminal prosecution of corporate executives who had created and implemented policies that violated federal law. "We're going to find out exactly how many companies are using these techniques," he said, his expression suggesting that the Victoria Chen assault was about to become the beginning of something much larger than anyone had anticipated. And we're going to find out whether federal transportation laws actually mean anything when companies decide they're too expensive to follow. The Hart Senate Office Building's largest hearing room had been configured for maximum media coverage, with television cameras positioned to capture every angle of what had become one of the most closely watched congressional hearings on transportation discrimination in decades. Senator Patricia Williams, the ranking member of the Senate Commerce Committee's Transportation Subcommittee, had spent 20 years investigating corporate accountability issues and understood that hearings like this one created opportunities to address problems that were typically handled through quiet settlements and internal policy adjustments that disappeared from public attention as soon as the news cycle moved on to other issues. Victoria Chen sat at the witness table with the kind of composed dignity that made every camera in the room focus on the faint scar on her forehead, a visible reminder of the violence that had brought everyone together in this room where senators would ask questions designed to generate sound bites while corporate executives would provide answers designed to minimize legal liability without actually admitting wrongdoing. She wore a navy blazer that was professional without being flashy, and when she spoke, her voice carried clearly throughout the room without any trace of the emotion that everyone expected from assault victims, but which she refused to provide for people who wanted drama more than solutions. Senator Williams, thank you for the opportunity to testify about what happened on Horizon Airlines Flight 447. Victoria began reading from notes that she had prepared with the same methodical attention her father had taught her to apply to every important presentation. I'm here not just because I was assaulted, but because the investigation has revealed that my experience was part of a deliberate corporate strategy of hiding discrimination rather than preventing it. The hearing room fell silent as Victoria described the morning of the assault with clinical precision, focusing on documented facts rather than personal feelings, providing timestamps and witness names and specific details that could be verified through video evidence and federal investigation records. Her testimony was devastating, not because it was emotional, but because it was comprehensive, methodical, and impossible to dismiss as exaggeration or misunderstanding. Senator Williams leaned forward as Victoria concluded her opening statement. Ms. Chen, did Horizon Airlines offer you a settlement that included confidentiality agreements? The question was designed to highlight corporate attempts to hide accountability through financial payments that prevented victims from discussing their experiences publicly. Yes, Senator Victoria replied without hesitation. Multiple settlement offers, each one contingent on agreements that would have prevented me from testifying here today or discussing the discrimination that led to the assault. She paused, looking directly at the Horizon executives seated at the corporate witness table. The message was clear. Take the money and stay quiet, or face years of legal proceedings designed to exhaust our resources and resolve. David Brooks followed Victoria to the witness table, carrying copies of video footage that had been enhanced by federal investigators to show details that were not visible in the original social media posts. His testimony focused on the passenger experience of witnessing discrimination and the corporate pressure that was applied to discourage witness cooperation with federal investigations. I was contacted by Horizon representatives who suggested that my testimony was unnecessary because the incident had been resolved internally. David said, his voice carrying the indignation of someone who had been personally insulted by corporate attempts to manipulate his cooperation with federal law enforcement. When I declined to withdraw my witness statement, I received a letter from corporate attorneys suggesting that my continued involvement could result in legal action for interfering with company operations. The corporate intimidation tactics that David described drew sharp questions from senators who understood that witness tampering in federal investigations could result in criminal charges for corporate executives who authorized or encouraged such behavior. Senator Williams asked David to describe the specific threats he had received, creating a record that federal prosecutors could use if they decided to expand their investigation to include obstruction of justice charges. Maria Rodriguez, the former Horizon Human Resources manager who had provided internal documents to federal investigators, testified about corporate policies that were specifically designed to avoid federal reporting requirements while protecting employees whose behavior generated ongoing discrimination complaints. Her testimony revealed a pattern of institutional misconduct that went far beyond individual employee problems to corporate executives who had created systems that enabled discrimination to flourish without consequences. We were instructed to reclassify discrimination complaints as customer service issues unless there was video evidence or physical injury that made denial impossible. Maria testified, reading from internal company emails that had been subpoenaed by federal investigators. The goal was to minimize legal liability and federal oversight rather than address the underlying behavior that was generating complaints. The internal emails that Maria provided showed Horizon executives explicitly discussing how to handle discrimination complaints in ways that would protect the company from federal investigation while avoiding the costs of actually training employees or implementing policies that would prevent discriminatory treatment of passengers. The documentation was comprehensive enough to support federal charges against multiple corporate executives for conspiracy to violate transportation laws. Senator Williams questioned the Horizon executives with the kind of methodical precision that came from having reviewed thousands of pages of internal documents before the hearing began. Mr. Hayes, did you personally approve policies that required human resources staff to reclassify discrimination complaints as customer service issues? The question was designed to establish personal accountability for corporate executives who typically attempted to claim ignorance of illegal policies that were implemented by subordinates. Richard Hayes, flanked by corporate attorneys who had spent the morning preparing him for questions that could result in criminal charges, provided the kind of carefully worded non-answers that corporate executives used when they were trying to avoid perjury charges while refusing to provide useful information. Senator company policies were developed through collaborative processes involving multiple departments and legal review. He said, reading from prepared talking points that had been designed to avoid any direct admission of personal knowledge or responsibility. The hearing continued for 6 hours with testimony from federal investigators, former employees, and passengers who had experienced similar discrimination on Horizon flights but had been discouraged from filing formal complaints through corporate policies that were designed to minimize legal liability rather than address passenger safety and civil rights concerns. By the time the hearing concluded, the record included enough evidence to support both criminal charges against corporate executives and federal legislation requiring airlines to implement measurable standards for equitable treatment of passengers. Senator Williams concluded the hearing with a statement that federal transportation laws were meaningless unless they included enforcement mechanisms that created real consequences for companies that chose to violate passenger rights, and announced that comprehensive transportation equity legislation would be introduced within 30 days, with support from both parties and multiple federal agencies that had been investigating similar practices throughout the airline industry. The emergency meeting of the Airlines for America Trade Association took place in a conference room that had hosted countless industry discussions about fuel costs, safety regulations, and competitive strategies, but never a crisis management session where the survival of multiple companies depended on their ability to demonstrate immediate and comprehensive reform in response to federal investigations that were expanding faster than corporate legal teams could contain them. Angela Foster, now the permanent CEO of Horizon Airlines, sat at a table surrounded by executives from Delta American United and Southwest, all of whom had received federal subpoenas for their own discrimination complaint records within 24 hours of the Congressional hearing that had revealed practices that were apparently widespread throughout the industry. We have 48 hours to announce voluntary compliance with federal oversight before the Department of Transportation moves to mandatory enforcement. Angela announced to the room, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from having successfully navigated the crisis that was now threatening everyone else at the table. Companies that get ahead of this will have input on how the new regulations are structured. Companies that wait for federal mandates will have compliance requirements imposed without consultation. The CEO of American Airlines, a man named Patrick Sullivan, who had spent 15 years climbing corporate hierarchies and had never faced a crisis that couldn't be resolved through legal settlements and public relations campaigns, looked around the table with the expression of someone who was beginning to understand that traditional corporate damage control strategies were not going to work against opponents who had rejected settlement offers and were demanding structural changes to how the entire industry operated. "What exactly is Chen Technologies demanding?" Patrick asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected that the demands would go far beyond anything the industry had previously been required to implement. Angela distributed copies of what was being called the Chen Protocol, a comprehensive framework for preventing, documenting, and addressing discrimination in transportation services that had been developed by legal experts, civil rights organizations, and federal agencies working together to create standards that would be both enforceable and effective. The Chen Protocol required airlines to implement independent oversight committees with authority to investigate discrimination complaints, maintain public databases of complaint resolution actions, provide quarterly reports to federal agencies on discrimination prevention efforts, and submit to regular compliance audits by organizations that were not affiliated with the companies being evaluated. The standards were comprehensive enough to address every aspect of passenger interaction from initial booking through final destination, with specific requirements for employee training, supervisor accountability, and corporate board oversight that would make discrimination prevention a measurable business priority rather than a public relations afterthought. "This is going to cost millions," said the representative from Southwest Airlines, a woman named Carol Zhang, who had been reviewing the financial implications of compliance with federal standards that were designed to prevent discrimination rather than simply respond to complaints after discrimination had already occurred. Independent oversight, public reporting, regular audits, employee training that actually works rather than just checking boxes for legal protection. Angela nodded, understanding the financial concerns while also recognizing that the costs of compliance were significantly less than the costs of continued federal investigation, criminal prosecution, and civil liability that would result from attempting to maintain policies that had already been demonstrated to violate federal law. Horizon's implementation costs were substantial in the short term, she said, pulling out financial reports that showed the first quarter results since implementing Chen Protocol standards. But customer satisfaction is up, employee retention is improved, and legal costs are down significantly because we're preventing problems rather than responding to crises. The meeting continued for 3 hours as industry executives reviewed federal requirements, discussed implementation timelines, and calculated the costs of compliance versus the costs of continued resistance to federal oversight that was becoming more comprehensive and aggressive with each passing day. By the end of the afternoon, 6 major airlines had agreed to voluntary implementation of Chen Protocol standards with public announcements, scheduled to demonstrate industry commitment to passenger rights and civil rights enforcement that would prevent the kind of incident that had exposed widespread discriminatory practices. Within weeks, the changes were visible to passengers throughout the transportation industry, with new reporting procedures posted prominently in airport terminals, employee training programs that focused on recognizing and preventing discriminatory behavior rather than simply avoiding legal liability, and oversight committees that included civil rights organizations and federal agency representatives who had authority to investigate complaints independently of corporate management. The transformation was comprehensive enough that passenger advocacy organizations began recommending airlines based on their commitment to equitable treatment, rather than just scheduling convenience and price competition. Federal agencies reported immediate improvements in complaint resolution, with discrimination issues being addressed through transparent processes that included measurable consequences for employees and managers who failed to meet federal standards for passenger treatment. The Department of Transportation established permanent oversight programs that monitored airline compliance with civil rights requirements, creating accountability mechanisms that had previously been missing from federal transportation policy. Beverly Walsh pleaded guilty to federal assault charges and was sentenced to community service probation and restitution payments that would continue for 5 years, during which time she was prohibited from working in any transportation-related position that involved passenger contact. Her criminal conviction became part of a federal database that prevented problematic employees from moving between airlines without disclosure of their disciplinary history, eliminating the industry practice of allowing employees with discrimination complaints to simply change companies and continue the same behavior. The Congressional Transportation Equity Bill was signed into law 6 months after Victoria Chen's testimony, creating federal standards for discrimination prevention and complaint resolution that applied to all forms of public transportation, including airlines, rail systems, bus companies, and ride-sharing services. The legislation included funding for enforcement mechanisms and civil rights training programs that were designed to prevent discrimination rather than simply respond to incidents after they occurred. Victoria Chen was appointed to the Federal Transportation Equity Advisory Committee, where she worked with civil rights organizations, industry representatives, and federal agencies to develop implementation guidelines that balanced passenger protection with operational practicality. Her position provided a platform for continued oversight of industry compliance and advocacy for passengers who continued to experience discrimination despite improved policies and training programs. Victoria Chen stood in her new office on the 40th floor of Chen Technologies headquarters, looking out at the Seattle skyline while reviewing quarterly reports that showed measurable improvements in transportation, discrimination, complaints, and resolution procedures across the industry that had been transformed by her refusal to accept settlement money and stay quiet about what had happened on that December morning, in a cold jetway where no one was supposed to be watching. The title on her door read, Head of Equity Innovation, a position that had been created specifically to focus corporate resources on developing and implementing solutions to discrimination problems that extended far beyond the aviation industry to affect every aspect of service delivery in hospitality, retail, and technology sectors. The work was challenging in ways that Victoria had not anticipated, partly because corporate executives who were enthusiastic about diversity initiatives during public relations campaigns often became resistant when asked to implement specific changes that required measurable accountability and ongoing oversight by independent organizations that could not be controlled or influenced by the companies they were evaluating. Her experience with forced implementation at Horizon Airlines had taught her that voluntary compliance programs were often designed more for publicity than effectiveness, which meant that meaningful change required external pressure and federal enforcement rather than corporate goodwill. Jonathan Chen had stepped back from day-to-day operations of Chen Technologies to focus on advocacy work and policy development, spending his time consulting with federal agencies and civil rights organizations on strategies for expanding transportation equity requirements to other industries where discrimination remained common, but largely unaddressed by existing legal frameworks. His transition from technology executive to civil rights advocate had been gradual, but deliberate, driven by recognition that his resources and platform could be used to create opportunities for systemic change rather than simply building wealth for his family. "You've accomplished something I never thought was possible," Jonathan told Victoria during one of their weekly strategy meetings, where they reviewed progress on various equity initiatives and planned responses to corporate resistance that continued to emerge as more companies were required to implement transparent accountability procedures. "You've made discrimination prevention a business priority rather than just a legal requirement." Victoria smiled, recognizing that her father's pride was both personal and professional, reflecting his understanding that sustainable change required more than legal victories or public relations campaigns, but demanded fundamental alterations to how companies measured success and allocated resources. "It's working because we're measuring outcomes rather than intentions," she replied, referencing the data collection and analysis systems that were now standard throughout the transportation industry and were being adapted for use in other sectors. David Brooks had left his marketing career to join Chen Technologies' equity team, where he used his media and communications expertise to document corporate compliance with discrimination prevention requirements and develop public reporting systems that made company performance on equity issues visible to consumers who were increasingly making purchase decisions based on corporate behavior rather than just product quality or price competition. His role involved creating transparency mechanisms that prevented companies from claiming compliance with equity requirements while maintaining practices that continued to discriminate against customers who belonged to protected classes. The impact of David's work was most visible in the airline industry, where passenger satisfaction surveys now included specific questions about discriminatory treatment, and companies were required to publish quarterly reports on complaint resolution procedures and employee training outcomes. Airlines that demonstrated consistent compliance with equity requirements reported improved customer retention and positive media coverage, while companies that continued to generate discrimination complaints faced public criticism and federal oversight that affected their ability to compete for business travelers and government contracts. Beverly Walsh had completed her court-mandated community service at a nonprofit organization that provided civil rights training for service industry employees, where she worked with people who had experienced workplace discrimination and learned to recognize the patterns of behavior that she had previously dismissed as normal business practices or customer service standards. Her transformation from perpetrator to advocate was neither complete nor simple, but it represented progress toward understanding how individual actions contributed to larger patterns of institutional discrimination. The nonprofit organization where Beverly worked reported that her personal experience with the consequences of discriminatory behavior made her an effective trainer for employees who were struggling to understand why certain actions were considered problematic, or how seemingly minor incidents could escalate into serious civil rights violations. Her story became part of training programs that emphasized the importance of recognizing early warning signs of discriminatory behavior and implementing intervention strategies before situations reached the point of violence or legal action. Angela Foster's leadership at Horizon Airlines had transformed the company from an industry embarrassment into a model for how transportation companies could implement comprehensive equity programs while maintaining operational efficiency and financial profitability. Under her direction, Horizon had become the first airline to achieve full compliance with all federal transportation equity requirements and had developed internal training programs that were being adopted by other companies throughout the industry. The success of Horizon's transformation demonstrated that equity initiatives could be implemented without sacrificing business performance, a lesson that was particularly important for corporate executives who had historically resisted civil rights requirements based on claims that compliance would be too expensive or operationally disruptive. Horizon's financial performance had actually improved following implementation of equity standards, largely because preventing discrimination was less expensive than responding to discrimination complaints, and because customers preferred companies that provided consistent and respectful service to all passengers, regardless of race, gender, or other characteristics. Robert Hayes, the supervisor who had initially dismissed Victoria's complaints about Beverly Walsh's behavior, had been terminated from his position at Horizon Airlines and had struggled to find comparable employment in the transportation industry, where his involvement in the incident had become part of his permanent professional record. His experience served as a warning to other managers about the personal consequences of failing to address discriminatory behavior by employees under their supervision. The broader impact of individual accountability measures had been significant throughout the industry, with supervisors and managers becoming much more responsive to discrimination complaints because they understood that their own careers could be affected by their handling of civil rights issues. This change in management behavior had resulted in earlier intervention in potentially problematic situations and more effective resolution of complaints before they escalated to the level of federal investigation or legal action. The departure lounge at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport looked exactly the same as it had 6 months earlier, with the same uncomfortable seating, the same overpriced food options, and the same crowds of travelers moving through the terminal with the weary determination that characterized modern air travel. But Victoria Chen noticed differences that were invisible to casual observers. but significant to anyone who understood what systematic change actually looked like when it was implemented correctly and maintained consistently. The gate agent's interaction with passengers showed a level of professional consistency that had previously been reserved for travelers who looked like they belonged in first class, and the boarding process proceeded with the kind of respectful efficiency that suggested employees had received training that actually changed behavior rather than simply checking boxes for legal compliance. Victoria approached the gate for Horizon Airlines Flight 273 to Chicago, with the same boarding pass that would have triggered additional scrutiny and discriminatory treatment 6 months earlier. But this time, her interaction with airline employees was marked by the kind of professional courtesy that should have been standard all along. The gate agent scanned her boarding pass without commentary about the cost or questions about how it had been purchased, and when first-class boarding was announced, she was welcomed aboard with the same warmth that was extended to every passenger, regardless of race, age, or any other characteristic that had previously influenced how airline employees decided who deserved respectful treatment. "Good morning, Ms. Chen," the flight attendant said, checking the passenger manifest to ensure she used the correct name rather than making assumptions about whether passengers belonged in the seats they had paid to occupy. "Can I help you with anything before we prepare for departure?" The tone was professional without being obsequious, suggesting that the employee had been trained to provide consistent service rather than adjusting her level of attention based on passenger demographics. Victoria settled into her seat with the awareness that this flight represented both a personal milestone and a professional validation of the work that had consumed her life for the past 6 months, transforming her from a corporate executive who happened to be Black into a civil rights advocate who was using technology sector resources to create accountability mechanisms that were changing how entire industries approached customer service and employee training. The changes were not perfect, and discrimination had not been eliminated entirely, but the improvements were measurable and sustainable because they were supported by federal oversight and public transparency, rather than depending solely on corporate goodwill. The jetway that had been the site of her assault 6 months earlier was now equipped with security cameras that provided continuous monitoring of passenger interactions with airline employees, a change that had been implemented throughout the Horizon fleet and was being adopted by other airlines as part of industry-wide reforms that made discriminatory behavior more difficult to hide and easier to document. The cameras were not obvious enough to create an oppressive atmosphere, but their presence served as a reminder that employee behavior was being monitored and that accountability measures were in place to address problems before they escalated to violence. During the flight, Victoria worked on her laptop reviewing materials for a presentation she would be giving to the United Nations Human Rights Council about using technology platforms to document and address transportation discrimination on an international scale. The invitation to speak at the UN represented recognition that the Chen Protocol was being studied by civil rights organizations and transportation companies around the world as a model for implementing comprehensive reform that balanced passenger protection with operational practicality. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with the kind of professional competence that made air travel pleasant rather than stressful, and Victoria noticed that the crew was more diverse than what had been typical for Horizon flights 6 months earlier. The company's new hiring and promotion practices had been designed to ensure that passenger service teams reflected the demographic diversity of the traveling public, a change that had improved customer satisfaction scores and reduced discrimination complaints because passengers were more likely to receive respectful treatment from employees who understood their experiences and perspectives. When the plane landed in Chicago, Victoria was met at the gate by Angela Foster, whose transformation from board member to CEO had made her one of the most visible corporate leaders advocating for equity initiatives in the transportation industry. Their meeting was scheduled to discuss expansion of the Chen Protocol to international markets where discrimination remained common, but legal frameworks for addressing passenger rights were often less developed than what existed in the United States. The European Union is interested in adapting the protocol for their transportation systems, Angela said, as they walked through the terminal toward the airport's business meeting facilities. They're particularly interested in the independent oversight mechanisms and the public reporting requirements that have been most effective at preventing discrimination rather than just responding to complaints after problems occur. Victoria nodded, understanding that international expansion of equity standards would require adaptation to different legal systems and cultural contexts while maintaining the core principles of transparency, accountability, and measurable outcomes that had made the original protocol effective. The key is ensuring that oversight mechanisms have real authority rather than just advisory roles, she replied, drawing on lessons learned from companies that had attempted to implement cosmetic changes rather than substantive reforms. Their meeting continued for 2 hours, covering implementation strategies, training requirements, and federal coordination issues that were becoming increasingly complex as the scope of equity initiatives expanded beyond the airline industry to include hotels, restaurants, retail companies, and technology platforms that had previously operated with minimal civil rights oversight. The work was challenging but necessary because discrimination problems were not limited to transportation services, but affected every aspect of commerce where companies had discretion about how to treat customers and employees. As Victoria prepared to return to Seattle that evening, she reflected on the fact that her experience 6 months earlier had been transformed from a moment of personal trauma into a platform for structural change that was affecting millions of travelers around the world. The scar on her forehead had faded but not disappeared, serving as a permanent reminder that dignity should not depend on documentation or advocacy, but should be guaranteed by systems that make discriminatory treatment impossible rather than simply illegal. The return flight proceeded without incident, as flights should, with professional service and respectful treatment that was consistent regardless of passenger characteristics or seat assignments. As the plane descended toward Seattle, Victoria looked out at the lights of the city where her family had built a technology empire, and where she was now using that platform to extend civil rights protections to industries and communities that had historically been overlooked by traditional advocacy organizations and federal enforcement agencies. 2 years after Beverly Walsh pushed Victoria Chen down a jetway in what seemed like an isolated moment of workplace violence, the incident had become the catalyst for the most comprehensive transformation of passenger rights and civil rights enforcement in the transportation industry's history, with federal agencies reporting significant reductions in discrimination complaints and measurable improvements in passenger satisfaction across all demographic groups. Victoria stood before the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, delivering a presentation about technology-enabled accountability systems that was being simultaneously translated into 12 languages for delegates representing countries where transportation discrimination remained common, but largely unaddressed by existing legal frameworks. Documentation protects dignity when systems fail. Victoria told the assembled representatives her words carrying the authority that came from having personally experienced both the trauma of discrimination and the satisfaction of creating meaningful change in response to that experience. But documentation alone is insufficient unless it is connected to accountability mechanisms that create real consequences for discriminatory behavior and sustainable protection for people who continue to face barriers based on race, gender, religion, or other characteristics that should be irrelevant to their treatment as customers and human beings. The presentation included case studies from the airline industry, showing how independent oversight committees, public reporting requirements, and federal enforcement mechanisms had created measurable improvements in passenger treatment while also improving operational efficiency and customer satisfaction for companies that had initially resisted implementing comprehensive equity standards. The data was compelling enough that several European Union members announced plans to adapt the Chen Protocol for their own transportation systems with implementation timelines that would make Europe a global leader in passenger rights protection. Victoria's book, The Jetway Moment: How One Assault Changed an Industry, had been published 6 months earlier and had become required reading in business schools, law schools, and public administration programs, where students were learning about the relationship between individual courage and institutional change. The book focused not on the trauma of discrimination, but on the strategic thinking and collaborative work that had been necessary to transform personal experience into policy change that affected millions of people who would never know her name, but would benefit from the systems that had been created in response to her refusal to accept settlement money and stay quiet. The United Nations presentation concluded with Victoria announcing the establishment of an international transportation equity monitoring program that would provide technical assistance and funding for countries that were committed to implementing comprehensive passenger rights protections, with support from technology companies, civil rights organizations, and federal agencies that had learned valuable lessons from the American experience with discrimination prevention and accountability enforcement. The program represented recognition that civil rights were human rights that required international cooperation and resource sharing, rather than individual country solutions to problems that affected travelers around the world. Jonathan Chen's transition from technology executive to civil rights advocate had been complete by this point, with his time divided between consulting with federal agencies on discrimination prevention policy and working with international organizations to expand equity standards to countries where civil rights protections remained limited or unenforced. His experience building Chen Technologies had provided valuable insights about using technology platforms to create transparency and accountability in industries that had historically operated with minimal oversight or public scrutiny. "We're not trying to punish companies for past discrimination," Jonathan explained during an interview with the Wall Street Journal about the economic impact of equity initiatives on corporate profitability and operational efficiency. "We're creating systems that make discrimination prevention a business priority because companies understand that treating customers fairly is more profitable than dealing with the consequences of discriminatory behavior." The interview was accompanied by financial data showing that companies with strong equity performance had better customer retention, employee satisfaction, and long-term growth than competitors that continued to generate civil rights complaints. The legal precedent established by Victoria's case had been applied to dozens of similar situations where passengers had experienced discrimination, but had previously been discouraged from pursuing federal complaints by settlement offers that required confidentiality agreements and non-disclosure requirements. Federal prosecutors had successfully pursued criminal charges against corporate executives in 3 other cases, where internal documents revealed deliberate policies designed to hide discrimination rather than prevent it, creating accountability at the executive level that had previously been missing from corporate civil rights enforcement. Beverly Walsh had completed her community service and probation requirements, but continued working with the nonprofit organization, where she provided training for service industry employees about recognizing and preventing discriminatory behavior. Her transformation from perpetrator to advocate was neither complete nor simple, but it represented progress toward understanding how individual actions contributed to larger patterns of institutional discrimination that affected communities and industries beyond any single workplace or company. "I spent 15 years thinking that treating certain passengers differently was just part of the job," Beverly said during a training session for hotel employees who were learning about the legal and ethical requirements of providing equal service to all customers, regardless of race, religion, or other characteristics. "It took facing the consequences of my actions to understand that discrimination isn't just wrong morally, it's destructive professionally and personally for everyone involved." The broader impact of the Chen Protocol extended far beyond the transportation industry to include hotels, restaurants, retail companies, and technology platforms that had voluntarily adopted similar accountability mechanisms after recognizing that equity initiatives improved customer satisfaction and reduced legal liability, while also creating competitive advantages in markets where consumers were increasingly making purchase decisions based on corporate behavior and values. The voluntary adoption of equity standards represented a fundamental shift in how companies approached civil rights compliance, from a legal requirement to a business opportunity. Angela Foster's leadership at Horizon Airlines had made the company a global leader in transportation equity, with executives from airlines around the world visiting their headquarters to study implementation strategies and training programs that had transformed a company culture while maintaining operational efficiency and financial profitability. Horizon's success demonstrated that comprehensive equity initiatives were not only compatible with business success, but were actually necessary for long-term competitiveness in markets where discrimination was becoming both legally risky and economically disadvantageous. Federal agencies reported that transportation discrimination complaints had decreased by 60% since implementation of the Chen Protocol, with the remaining complaints being resolved more quickly and transparently through independent oversight mechanisms that provided satisfaction to passengers while helping companies identify and address problems before they escalated to federal investigation or legal action. The improvement in complaint resolution had freed federal resources for proactive enforcement and policy development rather than reactive crisis management and litigation support. Victoria's work with the Transportation Equity Advisory Committee had expanded to include consultation with other industries that were facing similar challenges with discrimination, prevention, and accountability enforcement, creating opportunities for cross-sector learning and resource sharing that maximized the impact of limited civil rights enforcement resources while ensuring that lessons learned in one industry could benefit other sectors where discriminatory treatment remained common but poorly documented or addressed. 5 years after the assault, Victoria Chen stands before a graduating class of airline management trainees, her faded scar barely visible, as she addresses the diverse group of future industry leaders who will inherit transportation systems that prioritize dignity and respect for all passengers regardless of race, gender, or economic status. The Chen Protocol is now standard across global transportation networks, and discrimination complaints are handled transparently through independent oversight mechanisms that have made equality in travel a measurable reality rather than an aspirational goal. What began as one woman's refusal to remain silent has become an international framework for civil rights protection that extends far beyond aviation to every industry where service delivery affects human dignity. At Horizon Airlines, now recognized as a global leader in equitable transportation services, Angela Foster reviews quarterly reports showing improved customer satisfaction, increased employee retention, and enhanced profitability that demonstrates how accountability systems benefit companies as well as passengers. The transformation from crisis to excellence proves that civil rights compliance is not a burden on business performance, but an investment in sustainable success that attracts customers, employees, and investors who value ethical corporate behavior. Meanwhile, Beverly Walsh completes her final month of community service work forever changed by confronting the harm her actions caused and committed to ensuring that other service industry employees understand the personal and professional consequences of discriminatory behavior. Victoria's phone, the device that captured everything that December morning, sits framed in her office, a reminder that documentation protects dignity while silence protects harm. When people ask if the fight was worth the personal cost and professional disruption it required, she points to the millions of travelers who now move through the world with greater safety and respect. And the answer becomes clear. One moment of courage properly documented and persistently pursued can indeed transform entire industries and create lasting protection for people who deserve equal treatment simply because they are human beings worthy of dignity and respect. If this story moved you like this video to help us reach more people with this important message, subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things to make the world more fair and just. Your subscription helps us continue sharing these crucial stories that need to be told. And please share this video with your family, friends, and community. These stories of standing up for what's right, especially when it's difficult, need to reach as many people as possible. Together we can build a world where every person knows they belong wherever they've earned the right to be. Drop a comment below and tell us about a time when you or someone you know stood up against injustice. Your stories matter. Your voice matters.